So, just an intro. We're going to be talking about buffers. This is just kind of pulling from some of the slides I used over at Sweetwater that I created there in kind of a PowerPoint format. So we're talking about buffers, and the first thing that I want to be doing today with buffers is kind of talk to you about the where the best place is to put them. So I'm going to kind of have for you just like this sample pedal layout. So this I think I took it from Strymon or somebody else's website where they just kind of had a fictitious signal path that they were kind of using, and I'm not using it to illustrate anything that they were. I think it's just to help me show you where buffers are. So that we have this Rickenbacker guitar here. There's a compressor, a wah, an overdrive, a chorus, a tremolo, a volume pedal, a delay, reverb, and then amp. And the only thing that I would say that is objectionable at all about this is that the length between the reverb cable and the amp is probably way longer than that. Typically you would have the longest cable between those 2 points. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at that very last arrow that's going from the blue reverb into kind of the charcoal gray amp, that if that were illustrated sort of more to scale, that would be a much longer cable. But for the purposes of this, I think you can follow me so far. So basically the thing that I've been touting in a lot of the videos that we've put up is the need for high quality buffers, which there are very few of. There's lots of companies that make something called a buffer, but its effectiveness at doing that is actually not that effective. So the thing that I encourage all of you to look at when you're looking at buffers and evaluating their efficiency, because really a buffer should be a one-to-one amplifier. So whatever goes into it, it should represent that going out of it, so long as you're not turning on another pedal. So presuming that everything in our fictitious signal chain here is true bypass, it should sound the same if it's properly buffered as if that guitar were plugged into the amplifier with nothing else in between. If the quality of your buffers are doing their job, there should be no difference in tone between the guitar plugged directly into that amplifier at the end of the signal path as it is with everything in between. That's the best case scenario. That means it's not coloring the tone. Now, in order to do that, you need a certain minimum number of buffers to really make it happen effectively. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the thing that I really want you to know about is the specification that you're going to be looking for when you're going out and looking at your own buffers and which ones you might want to buy. You're going to be looking at the specification. So this is one I pulled off of TC Electronics' website. And this is one of the only buffers that I've found, other than the others that I'm going to mention today, that actually discuss what their input and output impedance is. So here it's 1 meg ohm and 100 ohm on the output. So 1 meg ohms on the input and 100 ohms on the output. So if we're looking at the bona fide buffer, which is right here, that means when you plug into it, it's seeing 1 meg. That's a very typical input impedance that you would see whenever you are plugging into any tube amplifier. So if it's a Fender amp, if it's a Marshall amp, almost every single amp that you can imagine that you likely engage with on a day-to-day basis, that's almost invariably going to be 1 meg on the input, no matter what. So this is why that's important, because your guitar is going to plug into that buffer first. So you want your guitar to feel and believe, internally in its circuit, to the degree to which circuits can believe anything, that it's seeing the input of an amplifier, because the way that we're used to our pickups reacting are as though we're plugging a 10-foot cable, let's say, into the front of the amp. So the buffer controls that pickup loading, gives the pickups what it wants to see. This is presuming they're passive. We'll talk about active pickups a little bit later. And then it's converting the signal to an ultra-low impedance. And really, I think a good way to understand the word impedance, if you're not sure what that means, is just sensitivity. If something's really high impedance, that means it's very sensitive to the environments that it's in. Changes environments, that can change how predictable that the product actually reacts, how it behaves in certain environments. If it's really low impedance, it means it's not really that sensitive. So you can put it in through different conditions, and if it's low impedance, it's likely not going to be very sensitive to the things around it, the environment with which it's in. So the cool thing about buffers, converting the signal to low impedance after that 1 meg input, is that it makes everything that it runs into less susceptible to problems environmentally. So you like to think of the buffer, or I like to think of the buffer, as sort of a firewall that isolates, at least on the input, the guitar from the pedalboard. But that's just one of the things that it does. You also need to have a buffer at the end of the signal path. So we're going back to my fictitious pedalboard layout. And not only are we putting a buffer at the beginning, you can see here I just added in a bona fide buffer right after the guitar, that's an input buffer. But I also put one at the end after the reverb, because as soon as you have any bona fide or any buffer of any kind going in, whether it's a bona fide or one of the other ones we're going to talk about, it's only effective to the point that you turn on one of these pedals. So if I turn on my compressor, let's say, which is the pedal that's right after that input buffer, and that's mostly on or an always on pedal for me, that means that my buffer is only effective until any pedal's turned on or I run into another buffer. So that could be a buffer in a pedal, or that could be another dedicated buffer. If this compressor, even if it's true bypass, is on, really my input buffer is only doing the job of isolating my guitar pickups, giving it the loading that it expects to see, and then it's buffering just a single patch cable that goes from it to the compressor. Everything else that exists after that would not be buffered. So in essence, if I'm going to do a fictitious signal path here, if I have a buffer, right, let's pretend this is the buffer, and this is my first pedal in line, and this is always on, the only thing my input buffer will be controlling is the patch cable that connects this to the buffer. If this is always on, now this is the buffer responsible for driving all the other cables and all the other pedals after it until it reaches either another buffer, could be inside a pedal like a Boss pedal, or another dedicated buffer, or another pedal that's turned on, and then that becomes the buffer from that point forward. The problem with that, though, is that most pedals, in fact, almost all pedals that I know of, are not typically designed with the idea that they're great line drivers or great buffers if it's an integrated kind of buffer as a part of the pedal, or any pedal turned on having a low enough output impedance to really drive long lines effectively or stably. So the problem becomes is that you're relying on a product that's not designed to drive a long cable, and as we talked about back in our fictitious layout, our longest cable is probably from the reverb to the amp. The very last pedal to the amp could be anywhere from 10 to 20 feet. And that's probably the longest individual cable that exists on our entire rig. So are we wanting to rely on a pedal, and I'm not picking on this particular pedal, it's really, this is just in place of almost any pedal that you can think of. This is designed to be a flanger. It's not usually a thought to be like, well, I need to be a flanger, and I also need to drive 100 feet of cable afterwards with no appreciable loss or any tone change. This is not that's not the impetus of this design, as it is for almost any other pedal. So the importance of having not only an input buffer to control the pickup so that they see the 1 meg that they would expect to see if you plugged into an amplifier, converts the signal to low impedance from there. Not only need that, because you're isolating the guitar from the pedal board, you also need to have the one at the end, which is the one, let me bring that up, that's the one that is driving from the last pedal the long cable back to the pedal board. And this makes it so that no individual pedal is responsible for driving too long of a line before it reaches the very end of the chain and then needs to have a nice quality buffer at the end. So what is a good quality buffer? So I've got a couple of them listed here for you. I, of course, have already talked about the TC Electronic Bonafide Buffer. This is the Rig Doctor's best buy. It's 69 bucks. It meets the criteria for what I talked about in terms of the specifications. So 1 meg is definitely what you want to have on the input. 100 ohms is about where you want it to be on the output. The range that I would look for is somewhere between about 80 ohms and about 150 ohms as the output impedance. But as the input impedance, like I said, 1 meg is the ideal because that's what your amplifier looks like. That's what your pickups are expecting to see if you want them to react the way that you're used to. So I highly recommend that you look for ones that have a 1 meg input impedance and between an 80 and about 150 ohm output impedance. A lot of people confuse the output impedance because a lot of companies will have like 100K. That's 10 times higher than 100 ohms. So you want to make sure that you are staying in that 80 to 150 ohm on the output impedance and 1 meg on the input impedance. If it's higher than that, it's going to make the buffer really bright and it's not going to be that neutral. If it's lower than that, like say 500 ohms, or 500K ohms, it's going to be a little darker, a little bit more rolled off. But if you want the most neutral, I highly suggest that you stay within that spec on the output impedance about 100 to 80, go as far as down as 80 and about as high up as 150. But you'll see if you look around at most of the buffers, almost none of them publish any of those specs. It would be like saying that you're designing a car for safety and not publishing any of the crash test results. If you're making a buffer and you're not within that spec, that means that you are not really a buffer and that you're going to be adding an appreciable amount of color to anything that comes after that buffer. And the longer the line is after that buffer and the more cable capacitance that's seen at the end of that buffer, the more unstable it's going to become. So this is something, again, that you really need to look at. You need to have that 1 meg input. You need to have that 80 to 150 ohm output impedance. That's what you're looking for, and you want to have two buffers. You want to have one at the beginning, right when the guitar comes in, and you want to have one at the very end before you drive that long cable back to your amplifier. Now, we talked about there being some contingencies. So one thing that some people have brought up is the idea of, what if you use a buffer or a wireless system like this Shure one here? Well, the Shure one does have a buffer inside of it. So anytime you have any sort of wireless system, that's buffer. That's low impedance at that point. If you had that, then you wouldn't need to have any sort of input buffer. You could have one and it wouldn't hurt, but you wouldn't need one if you were trying to save a few bucks. And you could just go with, say, using something like we talked about, like the bona fide buffer on the output. Now, a few other things that would be contingencies where you might not want to have a buffer, especially on the input, is on the conditions that you had a fuzz phase. So I'm bringing a fuzz phase here to give you an example. So here's the fuzz phase. Something like this would not be something that you would want to have an input buffer on. You would just want to use an output buffer, something like like the TC bona fide buffer that we talked about before, not that bona fide buffer. But here's some other ones I really like, if money is no object, that I think are really excellent. So the Shure buffer is one that I think is excellent. The cool thing about this one, especially for an output buffer, is it has an isolated output that's transformer isolated. It has a phase which is really should be called polarity, but most people confuse this. So this will allow you to either use it as a splitter if you wanted to use that ISO'd out as a tuner out, or if it was at the end of your chain and you were using it as an output buffer section, let's say for example, you could use that to split out to a second amp and be able to have that isolation and the polarity switch there if you did that. Another one that I really like is by Empress. There's two different versions. There's the mono version. There's also one that's not pictured here that doesn't have any sort of boost on it, which is even cheaper than this. There's also a stereo version, which is a little bit more expensive, but that has the ability to do stereo, split. It also has controls for polarity. It has controls for the isolation transformer, ground lifts, etc. Another one that I really like is the Mesa Boogie buffer, which is a dual buffer. This one has your input and output taken care of for you, so you wouldn't need to get two buffers like you would on the earlier ones I spoke about, like the Shure or the Shure and the Bonafide. This one has an input buffer and an output buffer. It also has a tuner out, and it has a boost in it that comes at the output of the entire buffer. And it also has a level compensation for the input, so if you're switching between, say, humbuckers and single coil pickups, you have the ability to make that compensation without making any adjustments to the buffer or having to change the tone in any way. That one is probably my favorite, although the only downside of that one is that it doesn't have any isolation transformer. So if you are planning to run stereo, or if you wanted to have a ground lift in some way or isolation to one of the amplifiers, you'd have to either get another buffer, which in that case I would recommend the Shure if you were going to be doing a stereo situation, or you could go with the Empress buffer, which is the one on the right here, which already has the isolation transformer built in. But those are the only ones, and I've searched for almost everything that are in that spec that I talked about, where they go from a 1 meg input impedance, and in fact the Empress one actually has a variable input impedance control, so you can actually knock it down to 500 if you wanted, or you could push it up to 2.2 megs if you wanted. So you can get a really unloaded type sound, you can get something that's a little more loaded down, or you can get something that's totally neutral. So that ability is actually pretty cool, and you could use that stereo buffer as a mono buffer if you wanted, and you just wanted to add those capabilities. So any of those are great, and they actually publish the specifications and understand that this is the criteria for a quality input and output buffer, and understand, at least in the case of the Mesa Boogie and in the case of the Empress, that a dual buffer is really a necessity. And of course the cheapest dual buffer on there that we saw that actually is a dual buffer, not just a single buffer where you'd have to buy two of them in order to do that, is the smaller Empress on the left there. It's mono and it has the boost in it, but there's also actually a cheaper one that's around $100 that's got the dual buffer, and it falls within that spec. So that was a lot of stuff. We just did 30 minutes or so just talking about buffers.